The next talk is about cervical alignment. I love cervical alignment because I think there still is a lot to do, and it's actually way more complicated than the lumbar spine. So we used to look at the cervical spine as a standalone entities. So we have a cervical X-ray, we look at it, we try to find some parameter that makes sense. Recently, we also look at the cervical spine more from a dynamic point of view, and it seems to be more relevant from a clinical point of view, because at the end, the main objective of the cervical spine is to be mobile, to maintain horizontal gaze, so it needs to move. But now, we start to rethink the way we analyze the cervical spine, because what is happening is that the patient comes in one piece to see you, and then we take X-ray and we cut down in small piece. So if we were to analyze this small X-ray without having the global overview, we may miss some of the component. And so one way to think about the radiographic evaluation of the cervical spine will be like, okay, I'm going to look at the cervical alignment, and we can go over some of the parameter, but I also want to make sure that I know how to evaluate the horizontal gaze, because that's what you need to function. And then I want to make sure that my cervical spine match whatever is happening below. So match the thoracic, lumbar, and pelvic alignment. And you will see, if we stop talking about too many parameters, it will make sense. It starts to get very confusing when we put too many parameters. So the regional curvature, and this is you know that way better than me. How do we evaluate the regional cervical spine? We just measure the cervical lordosis from C2 to C7. We're going to talk about the normative value, because this is not as obvious as we used to think. Another regional parameter is just a plumb line. So the plumb line was described a while ago. So we want the plumb line from C2 to be within a few centimeters of C7. The plumb line correlates with clinical outcome, but the problem is that, like any plumb line, as soon as I move, my plumb line is going to move. So it's a moving target. It's difficult really to assess. From a focal and dynamic point of view, so we did two studies. One was on cervical deformity, and the other one was on cervical myelopathy. And we tried to look at all those parameters and say, hold on, which one are relevant? Which one correlate with the patient's symptomatology? And what we found is that on one end, what matters is more the focal deformity. So let's say you have a patient with several focal kyphosis in the cervical spine. You know that probably this patient is going to have some myelopathy sign. So the shape of the cervical spine doesn't really matter. It's more like the focal one. And the second aspect is the dynamic. So the range of motion, but also how much you move, because you can have a big range of motion just from the upper part of the cervical spine. But we really want to look at the area covered by the cervical spine from the full extension to the full flexion. And those two parameters are way more clinically relevant than any of the regional parameters that we've used in the past. In terms of horizontal gaze, so what is interesting is that first the upper part of the cervical spine in asymptomatic subject is kind of constant, so about 15 degrees. And that's where you have your reserve. And so what I like to do when I look at an X-ray on a patient with deformity and cervical deformity, I like to look at the gap between the occiput and the first spinous process. So if they touch each other, then you know it's full extension. In terms of horizontal gaze, there is a ton of parameters, but I see the easiest one is the CBVA that was first described on a picture of patient. And we demonstrate in the past that this correlates also with patientreported.com. But there is two boundaries, because if your head is stuck up, you cannot function. If it's stuck down, you cannot function. So there's a window. So a window between 5 degrees up and 18 degrees down, where the patient can function. So now let's talk about the normal cervical lordosis. First, I don't like the term cervical lordosis because I think it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because in the asymptomatic population, 30%, so not 13, 30, of the subject have a kyphotic cervical spine. So for 1/3 of the normal population, the cervical spine is in kyphotic alignment. So let's talk about cervical curvature, not lordotic or kyphotic. So that's a huge number, and it was demonstrated like more than 10 years ago by Faline, and more recently by Leuwek. The second reason is that the shape of the cervical spine is going to be affected by everything that is happening below. So look at those 4 subjects. From left to right, here you have an increase in thoracic kyphosis, and here you have a big sagittal deformity. As T1 tilts forward, what do you think is happening? Cervical lordosis is becoming more and more pronounced. So if you take an X-ray of the cervical spine and you have a beautiful cervical lordosis, there's probably something going on below. So you need to understand why T1 is so steep. And finally, like the cervical spine is the shape is gonna depend on our position. We're not gonna have the same curvature in standing versus in sitting. The impact of age, I think it was mentioned yesterday in one of the presentations. So life is a kyphotic event. When we get older, trunk tilt forward, T1 slope become more and more steep. Therefore, the lordosis become nicer and nicer, more pronounced. And so this really raises the question, like when you go to a cervical meeting, like we always want to restore the cervical lordosis. But maybe that's not the correct objective. Maybe we need to restore the cervical curvature that this specific patient needs. And sometimes it's a flat neck. Sometimes it's a little bit of kyphosis. So how do we know? We did a study where we looked at not only our asymptomatic database, but also we looked at all of patients that were able to maintain an horizontal gaze and that were also able to maintain a mobility of the cervical spine. And what we found was quite interesting is that in those 2 databases, if you want to have an horizontal gaze and a flexible cervical spine, you need to have a cervical lordosis that is 17 degrees smaller than your T1 slope. Look at that. 3 different patients. So here you have a cervicothoracic kyphosis. T1 slope, 80 degrees almost. C2, C7 lordosis, 62. The gap between the two was 17. Second case, 40 degrees of T1 slope, 23 degrees of cervical lordosis. The gap, 16. And this one, the T1 slope is almost horizontal. So if you're on a gap of 16 to 17, that means that you need a kyphotic cervical spine. So to maintain a horizontal gaze, you need to make sure that the cervical lordosis is proportional to your T1 slope. So the same, remember like in the first talk, we talked about lordosis versus the orientation of the pelvis. It's exactly the same. The cervical curvature should be proportional to the slope of T1. So this is like an example. Maybe I'm going to skip this case so that we have time for question. And let me go like to the last part of the talk, which is, and that's always like tricky in any pathology. When you measure a parameter to try to identify, is it a deformity parameter or is that a compensation? Because sometimes they kind of look the same. So we did like a few studies to try to identify what does matter in the setting of cervical deformity. So what do we know about cervical deformity? First, we know that this pathology has a huge impact on the quality of life. So if you compare the cervical deformity patient here to the other pathology, you know, they are as bad as patients with some form of cancer. So it's not a radiographic disease. It's a disease that really affects the quality of life of the patient. And we used to define a cervical deformity as, okay, a kyphosis greater than 10 degrees. That's how we used to define that. But based on whatever we talk, we know that it doesn't really make sense. And when you look at all those patients, you're like, there's such variability in the type of deformity. And so first we took a group of surgeons. We show them like the X-ray of cervical deformity, so the cervical spine, the full spine, the dynamic spine, and you're like, do you think this is a severe cervical deformity, yes or no? And without looking at any number, I mean, all of you, if I give you like a very bad X-ray, you will tell me like, oh yeah, that's very bad. And so we group the patient as very bad cervical deformity versus like, kind of okay. And then we looked at our very bad cervical deformity, and what we found using some mathematical model is that the way to really identify a deformity was actually if the deformity was still present in extension. Because you can have like, you know, a bad looking neck, but if you have some flexibility and maybe like if the kyphosis is correct in extension, it's actually not that bad. But if in extension you still have a kyphosis, your C1 slope is still off, then most of those patients were classified as severe deformity. And what is quite interesting is that we were also able to define different morphotype of cervical deformity. So the first one is what we call the focal deformity. So when you have like some focal kyphosis, not only in neutral position, but also in extension. The second one is like the lack of compensation. So it's like kind of like your chest and chin patient. So you have a big cervical SVA, but if you put them the patient on extension, you can say, oh, you do have some reserve. But those patients, they don't use it. So maybe it's more a soft tissue, a muscular problem where really like the neck just falls. And they're very different from the focal deformity. And the last group, which is like a growing group, will be like the cervicothoracic deformity. So it's typically the patient that had a long fusion, maybe to T2, T4, develop a PJK, severe PJK. Now you have a big T1 slope. The patient hyperextends the neck, but it's not sufficient because deformity is so big that they cannot just compensate. And that's like the three patterns that we think define cervical deformity. So let me conclude. So just in conclusion, the cervical spine is very difficult to look at the cervical spine just alone. More and more, I think that we need to look at the cervical spine versus what is happening below. So with an X-ray or just with your clinical evaluation. The dynamic impact seems to be way greater than just a static measurement. Cervical deformity cannot be defined with just one parameter, is a pattern. And I think we're just starting. We're just starting because at one point in all our analysis, we're going to have to include like the analysis of the muscle, the analysis of really like the quality of the motion. So it's just the beginning. Thank you.